Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It focuses on the analysis of cinematic themes, historical trends in filmmaking, and the cultural depiction of legal and social structures within American independent cinema. This video does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Every divorce case is governed by specific state laws and individual circumstances that require consultation with licensed professionals, including attorneys and financial advisors. The historical trends and case studies discussed here are interpretations of fictional narratives and do not serve as a guide for real-world legal proceedings. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and seek professional counsel before making any decisions related to matrimonial law or personal finance. The American independent film is not interested in your happy ending. In fact, it is the only genre of storytelling in the United States that is obsessed with the exact moment your life falls apart. While mainstream Hollywood often treats divorce as a punchline in a romantic comedy or a sanitized plot point in a family drama, independent cinema treats it like a crime scene. Consider this. Statistical historical trends in the United States show that nearly half of all marriages may end in dissolution. Yet when we look at the male experience on screen, there is a massive gap between the heroic bachelor trope and the reality of the displaced father. There is a specific haunting image that recurs in the Sundance-winning entries of the last 30 years. A man sitting in a half-furnished apartment, eating a cold meal over a cardboard box, realizing that the legal and social architecture he built his identity upon has completely evaporated. This is the great unraveling. We are conditioned to believe that if we follow the rules, work the job, and provide for the family, the system will protect our status. But independent cinema tells a different story. It suggests that for men, divorce is not just a legal filing. It is an existential erasure. In this deep dive masterclass, we are opening a loop that most media outlets are too afraid to touch. We are going to examine why the indie lens is the only one that captures the raw, unvarnished truth of the male divorce experience. From the psychological warfare of custody battles to the silent, crushing weight of financial restructuring. This 10-part series is designed to solve a specific problem for the modern American audience: the lack of a realistic roadmap for understanding the narrative of male transition during domestic collapse. Today, men are often caught between two extremes: the alpha influencer who tells them to move on without emotion, and the traditionalist who views them as a failure. By analyzing the masterpieces of independent film, we provide a third path: a historical and cultural analysis of what it actually looks like to lose everything and rebuild. This part of the series serves as your entry point into the deep dive. We are moving beyond the surface-level tropes. We are looking at the potential outcomes of the contested versus uncontested narrative, as seen through the eyes of directors who have lived it. We are going to look at the step-by-step breakdown of how cinema depicts the loss of the home, the negotiation of the visitor status with one's own children, and the grueling process of reclaiming a sense of self when the title of husband and father is legally redefined. This is the promise of this series. By the end of these 10 parts, you will understand the anatomy of the American divorce more clearly than if you had read 100 legal textbooks, because we are looking at the emotional and structural data that the textbooks leave out. To understand why this matters, we must first look at the historical trends of the man in crisis archetype. In the 1970s, films like 5 Easy Pieces began to strip away the artifice of the American dream, but it was the rise of the independent movement in the 90s and 2000s that truly weaponized the divorce narrative. Think about the specific case study of Noah Baumbach's The Squid and the Whale. This isn't just a movie about a family splitting up. It is a clinical observation of the intellectual man, realizing he has no actual power in his domestic sphere. We see a step-by-step breakdown of the joint custody myth. The film shows the logistical nightmare of Tuesday/Thursday and every other weekend, not as a convenient arrangement, but as a visual representation of a man being partitioned out of his own legacy. This suggests that for many men, the transition to a non-custodial or shared custody parent involves a 25% to 40% decline in their standard of living, coupled with the total loss of their primary social support network. Independent film captures this by focusing on the smallness of the new life. The camera lingers on the cramped hallways, the mismatched furniture, and the silence of an apartment that was never meant to be a home. We must also address the legal procedural as a horror subgenre within independent film. While a show like Law and Order makes the courtroom look like a place of logic and justice, indie films like Marriage Story depict it as a meat grinder. The process is a key element of our masterclass. We will analyze the step-by-step escalation where a mutual agreement becomes a strategic offensive. In these films, we see the potential outcomes of hiring aggressive counsel versus collaborative counsel. We see the way the male protagonist is often blindsided by the valuation of his life. In the independent narrative, the man often starts with the assumption of fairness, only to realize that the legal system is an adversarial machine designed to maximize conflict for the sake of billable hours. This realization is a pivotal moment in the viral hook of these films. The moment the protagonist realizes that his story is no longer his to tell. It is now a series of affidavits and financial disclosures. Furthermore, we are going to explore the concept of financial masculinity and its collapse. In the US, the historical trend has long tied a man's worth to his role as the provider. When a divorce occurs in an independent film, the provider role is often weaponized against the man. We see characters who are forced to maintain the same level of financial output while having zero control over the domestic input. We will look at examples where the protagonist's career begins to falter because the emotional bandwidth required to manage a high-conflict divorce leaves him with nothing for the boardroom or the job site. This is a crucial step in the unraveling process. It's not just about the money leaving the bank account. It's about the psychological shift from building a future to paying for the past. This series will provide a deep dive into how these films use visual motifs, like the repetitive writing of checks or the selling of prized possessions, to communicate a loss of agency. We are also going to examine the social ghosting that men face, a theme heavily explored in the mumblecore and gritty realism sectors of independent film. When the divorce happens, the social circle often bifurcates. Case studies show that men are more likely to lose contact with couple friends and are less likely to have a secondary emotional support system compared to their ex-spouses. The films we will analyze show the protagonist trying to re-enter the world, only to find that he is a social liability. He is the divorced guy, a cautionary tale that his married friends want to avoid. We will look at the specific dialogue techniques used in these scripts to show the isolation of the male experience, the awkward silences, the invitations that stop coming, and the internal struggle to define oneself outside of the nuclear family unit. This masterclass is not just about the end of something, it is about the middle. The middle is where the most significant data points lie. It is the period between the decision and the decree. This is where the independent film excels. It focuses on the mundane, grueling steps. The inventory of assets the first night alone, the first time seeing the children in a neutral location. We are going to provide a step-by-step analysis of these transition scenes to show how they reflect the real-world challenges faced by men in the US legal system today. We will compare historical trends in film from the no-fault revolution of the 70s to the equal parenting movements of the 2020s, showing how cinema has, or hasn't, kept up with the changing landscape of father's rights. By the time we finish part 1, you will understand that the indie divorce movie is actually a blueprint for resilience. It shows the worst-case scenarios, the potential outcomes of poor strategy, and the brutal reality of the system, but it also shows the after. It shows the man who eventually learns to cook for himself, who builds a new relationship with his children based on quality rather than proximity, and who eventually finds a version of himself that isn't dependent on another person's validation. This is the promise we are fulfilling. A deep, uncompromising look at the most difficult transition a man can face, filtered through the most honest lens in cinema. We are moving beyond the surface. We are going deep into the data, the stories, and the hard truths of American independent film. Welcome to the masterclass. To understand the anatomy of displacement, we have to look at the setting. In the world of American independent film, the house is never just a house. It is a character that actively rejects the man once the legal gears of divorce begin to turn. Take the historical trends seen in films like Manchester by the Sea. While the narrative is centered on grief, the subtext is a masterclass in the loss of domestic belonging. When we see Lee Chandler in his basement apartment, the cinematography emphasizes the low ceilings and the lack of natural light. This is not just an aesthetic choice. It is a step-by-step visual representation of a man being pushed into the subterranean levels of society. Independent filmmakers use these cramped spaces to highlight the transition from the master of the house to a tenant of a life he no longer recognizes. In the US today, particularly as we navigate the economic landscape of 2026, this cinematic trope has become a stark reality for many. The rising cost of housing means that the post-divorce living situation for men is often a significant downgrade, a data point that indie cinema captures with brutal honesty. Imagine if you are a man named Jack, living in a suburb of Austin, Texas, in 2026. Jack is a mid-level project manager who spent 15 years building a life that looked perfect on paper. In the opening act of an independent film based on Jack's life, the camera wouldn't focus on the shouting matches. It would focus on the morning after the decision is made. It would show Jack standing in his own kitchen, realizing he no longer knows which drawer holds the silverware he bought with his own salary. This is the concept of the domestic stranger. Independent film excels at showing the potential outcomes of this estrangement. Jack becomes a guest in his own home. He begins to move through the rooms with a sense of apology. This is a crucial phase in the cinematic deep dive of male divorce, the psychological surrender of space. Historical trends in cinema show a shift from the high-stakes courtroom dramas of the 1980s to the domestic Cold Wars of the 2020s. In 2026, the independent lens is focused on the digital footprint of the split. We see case studies where the male protagonist is locked out of smart home systems or loses access to shared digital legacies. This adds a layer of modern erasure that previous generations of filmmakers didn't have to contend with. The film Marriage Story provides a foundational case study for this masterclass. Notice the scene where Charlie, the father, attempts to install a car seat while his son looks on with a mix of confusion and pity. This isn't just a scene about a car seat. It is a step-by-step breakdown of the loss of competence. In his own home, Charlie was a functional, respected father. In the independent space of a rented apartment, he is a man failing at a basic task. This highlights the data showing that men often experience a sharp decline in their perceived self-efficacy during the initial stages of a domestic split. The financial restructuring of a man's life in independent film is never handled with a spreadsheet. It is handled through the lens of sacrifice. In the 2026 cinematic landscape, we see a recurring theme of the gig economy being used as a survival mechanism for the divorced man. Case studies of recent independent scripts show protagonists who are forced into secondary and tertiary roles just to maintain the lifestyle maintenance payments that the court has dictated. This is where the deep dive gets uncomfortable. Independent film doesn't look away from the numbers. It shows the man eating the same cheap meal 5 nights a week because the potential outcomes of missing a payment are too severe to contemplate. It shows the step-by-step liquidation of hobbies, and small luxuries that once defined his personality. By stripping the character of these items, the filmmaker is showing the audience the literal deconstruction of the male ego. Consider the role of the visitation schedule as a narrative device. In mainstream media, this is often brushed over with a montage of happy playground visits. Independent film, however, treats the visitation schedule like a ticking clock in a thriller. We see the man waiting in a neutral location, like a mall food court or a public park, checking his watch every 30 seconds. This is the visualization of the visitor status. The data suggests that the transition to a non-custodial parent can lead to a profound sense of identity crisis. Indie cinema captures this by focusing on the silence after the children are dropped off. The camera stays on the man as he walks back to his car. There is no music. There is no dialogue. There is only the realization that his role as a father has been reduced to a series of scheduled interactions. This is a step-by-step erasure of the daily, mundane fatherhood that provides the most stable foundation for a man's sense of purpose. We must also analyze the case study of the squid and the whale. This film is essential for understanding the intellectualization of the split. The father, Bernard, uses his status as a writer to try and control the narrative of the divorce. This is a common defense mechanism. If you can name the problem, you can control it. But as the film progresses, the independent lens shows us that his intellectual superiority is a hollow shield. He is still losing his home, his influence over his sons, and his social standing. This serves as a warning for the US audience of 2026. Logic is not a defense against the emotional and legal machinery of a domestic dissolution. The film provides a detailed look at the potential outcomes of using children as confidants or pawns in a narrative war. It shows that the man who tries to win the divorce often loses the relationship with his children in the process. Step by step, independent cinema deconstructs the myth of the clean break. There is no such thing as a clean break in a deep dive analysis. Every action has a lingering consequence. In 2026, filmmakers are using the concept of the ghost marriage to describe the period where a man is legally divorced but emotionally and financially tethered to his past. We see this in scenes where the protagonist is still fixing the plumbing in his old house or receiving mail for his ex-wife. These are not just chores. They are the invisible threads that keep him from moving forward. The film focuses on these threads because they represent the reality of the male experience in the United States. The legal system might say it is over, but the social and emotional structures of a man's life take much longer to rebuild. As we move forward in this masterclass, we have to look at the moment the man decides to stop being a victim of his own narrative. But before he can do that, he has to hit the absolute floor of his new reality. In independent film, this floor is often represented by the first holiday spent alone. We see the step-by-step preparation for a celebration that will never happen. We see the man buying a small tree or a single gift, only to realize there is no one there to see it. This is the peak of the erasure. It is the moment where the old identity is completely gone, and the new one has not yet formed. But what happens when the legal battle moves from the living room to the digital sphere? How does a man in 2026 defend a reputation that is being dismantled in real time across social networks and professional circles? What is the one mistake that almost every male protagonist in an independent film makes that ensures his failure in the eyes of the court and his family? We will examine the specific, high-stakes errors in judgment that turn a manageable separation into a total systemic collapse, as we continue this deep dive into the architecture of the male divorce experience. In the next part, we look at the specific legal archetypes that independent film uses to represent the adversarial nature of the American system, and how the 2026 male character is being rewritten to survive them. In the landscape of American independent film, the courtroom is rarely a place of grand speeches or soaring music. Instead, it is a sterile, claustrophobic box where the legal archetype of the shark is introduced to dismantle a man's life with surgical precision. To understand the 2026 male character in this setting, we must look at the shift from the traditional lawyer to the clinical strategist. Historically, cinematic lawyers were advocates for justice, but in modern indie cinema, they are depicted as the architects of a scorched earth policy. Take the case study of Marriage Story, which serves as a foundational text for this masterclass. The character of Nora Fanshawe represents a specific legal archetype, the empathic predator. She doesn't just want the assets, she wants the narrative. She weaponizes the man's own vulnerabilities, turning his casual mistakes into documented evidence of incompetence. This reflects a broader historical trend in the U.S. legal system, where the process of discovery has moved from filing cabinets to a digital panopticon. Imagine if you are Michael, a 34-year-old software engineer living in Denver in 2026. Michael is a character we might see in a contemporary A24 or Neon production. His divorce isn't happening in a mahogany-paneled room. It's happening through a series of cold, efficient Zoom hearings and AI-driven mediation platforms. In the film of Michael's life, the antagonist isn't just his ex-spouse, it's the algorithm of fairness. The independent lens focuses on Michael's face as he stares at a screen, realizing that a piece of software is calculating the value of his relationship with his children based on a series of data points. This is the new legal reality portrayed in independent film, the dehumanization of the dispute. The step-by-step escalation begins with the temporary orders. In Michael's story, these orders are the first strike. Within 48 hours of filing, he is legally barred from his home and limited to supervised visits. The independent film doesn't skip to the final decree. It lingers on the weeks of uncertainty where these temporary orders become a permanent psychological weight. The data regarding legal outcomes for men in the United States shows that the initial temporary hearing often sets the tone for the entire case. Independent cinema captures the potential outcomes of these early skirmishes with brutal honesty. We see the protagonist, like Michael, realizing that every text message sent in a moment of anger, every late arrival for a school pickup, and every financial expenditure is being indexed. The film provides a detailed look at the paper trail. We see a step-by-step breakdown of the discovery phase. The man is forced to hand over his entire digital history. In a 2026 cinematic context, this includes his location data, his biometric health stats from his smartwatch, and his private search history. The indie filmmaker uses this to show that privacy is the first casualty of the legal process. Another critical legal archetype in these films is the guardian ad litem, the third-party observer who enters the man's new, cramped living space to judge his fitness as a parent. In movies like The Place Beyond the Pines or more recent domestic dramas, this character is often portrayed as a dispassionate bureaucrat. They are the person who counts the items in the refrigerator and checks for a proper bed for the child. The step-by-step detail of these home visits is used to highlight the man's sense of being an outsider in his own family structure. The data suggests that for many men, The presence of a guardian ad litem can feel like an intrusion of the state into the most intimate parts of their lives. The independent film captures the performance the man must put on, the forced smiles, the artificial tidiness, while knowing that his entire future as a father rests on a 3-hour observation. We must also analyze the financial bleed, which is a central theme in the 2026 male divorce narrative. The historical trend has moved away from the wealthy man losing half his fortune to the average man being buried under a mountain of legal fees and debt. The independent film shows the step-by-step liquidation of his identity. Michael, our Denver engineer, is forced to sell his car, his home office equipment, and even his hobbies to keep up with the retainer fees. This isn't just about money. It's about the erasure of the things that make him Michael. The film uses a fast-paced, high-retention editing style to show the rapid decline of his bank account, alongside the rising stack of legal documents. This mirrors the real-world pressure where the cost of a contested divorce in a major U.S. city can easily exceed a year's salary for a middle-class professional. Case studies of independent scripts often highlight the discrepancy between the man's perception of the law and the reality of the courtroom. The man often enters the process believing in the concept of truth. He thinks that if he just explains his side, the judge will see his value. But the independent film deconstructs this myth. It shows that the law is not interested in the truth, it is interested in the record. The record is what the lawyers build. We see the man's realization that his actual life and the legal record of his life are two different things. This is a pivotal open loop in the narrative. How does a man reconcile his identity when the legal system has officially labeled him as something else? Step by step, the 2026 independent film shows the man being outmaneuvered not by superior ethics, but by superior strategy. The use of stalling tactics, the filing of multiple motions to drain the opponent's resources, and the tactical use of emotional triggers are all depicted as standard operating procedures. The audience watches Michael receive a notification on his phone during a work meeting. Another motion filed, another $5,000 needed for his attorney. The camera stays on his face as he tries to maintain his professional composure, while his personal life is being dismantled in the background. This highlights the data showing that divorce is a leading cause of career instability for men, a potential outcome that many fail to prepare for. The independent film also explores the archetype of the disillusioned lawyer, the one Michael hires who tells him that the system is broken, but that he has to play the game anyway. This character serves as the voice of the system's cold reality. They explain the potential outcomes of a trial versus a settlement, showing that even a win feels like a loss. This is a deep dive into the philosophy of the American adversarial system. It is a game of attrition where the survivor is the one who can endure the most damage. But there is a darker element emerging in the 2026 cinematic landscape: the use of social media and public perception as a legal tool. How does a man defend himself when his private legal battle is being litigated in the court of public opinion? In the next part of this masterclass, we will explore the social erasure of the divorced man. We will examine how a man's professional network and social circle can be weaponized against him, and the specific scene that almost every independent film uses to show the moment a man becomes a ghost in his own community. What happens when the people you thought were your allies suddenly stop answering your calls? We dive into the psychology of social displacement and the strategy of character assassination as we continue this deep dive into the male experience in American independent film. Social displacement is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, methodical leak that leaves the male protagonist standing in a vacuum. In the context of American independent film, this is often depicted as the Great Evacuation. Friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances begin to exit the frame, not out of malice, but out of a profound social discomfort. To understand the 2026 male character, we have to examine the mechanism of the soft block. Imagine if you are David, a 42-year-old architectural consultant in Seattle. In the film of David's life, the year is 2026, and his social life is mediated through synchronized calendar apps and professional networking platforms. The moment the divorce is made public, David notices a subtle but undeniable shift. He isn't removed from the group chats. He is simply no longer tagged in the plans. He sees the photos of the Friday night dinner parties, the ones he used to host, and he realizes he has been digitally airbrushed out of his own community. Independent cinema captures this with a specific visual language. The camera often stays wide, showing David in a crowded space, perhaps a high-end office or a neighborhood cafe, where he is physically present but socially invisible. This is the step-by-step process of social erasure. It begins with the decline of the check-in text. Historical trends in male social dynamics suggest that men often rely on their spouses to maintain the couple-friend infrastructure. When that infrastructure collapses, the man is left without the primary architect of his social life. The data indicates that men can lose up to 75% of their social support network within the first year of a contested divorce. Indie films like The Squid and the Whale or Blue Valentine highlight this by showing the man attempting to reach out to old friends, only to find that the shared history has been claimed by the other side. The strategy of character assassination in 2026 is no longer about overt lies. It is about the curation of concern. In the independent film narrative, we see the ex-spouse or their social circle using the language of therapeutic intervention to dismantle the man's reputation. They don't say David is a bad person. They say they are worried about his stability. They don't say he is aggressive. They say they are prioritizing a safe environment. This linguistic shift is a powerful tool in the adversarial system of 2026. Step by step, David's professional reputation begins to erode. In a deep dive into the script of a modern indie drama, we would see a scene where David's boss calls him in for a performance review. The boss doesn't mention the divorce. Instead, he mentions a vague sense of a lack of cultural fit or a need for David to take some personal time. This is the cinematic representation of the professional fallout. It's not a firing. It's a gentle push toward the exit. Case studies of independent films often focus on the one friend who stays. This character is usually the truth teller, the one who explains the potential outcomes of David's social isolation. In a 2026 setting, this friend might be the one who shows David the whisper networks. These are the private threads where his character is being dissected. The film uses these moments to heighten the stakes. David realizes that his silence, which he thought was a sign of dignity, is being interpreted as an admission of guilt. This is a crucial pivot point in the male divorce narrative. The realization that the man must participate in the battle for his own reputation or be defined by his detractors. We must also look at the cinematic trope of the first social event alone. This is a staple of the American independent film, because it provides a concentrated look at the man's new status. Imagine a scene where David attends a gallery opening in 2026. He walks into the room, and for a split second the conversation stops. It's the sound of people recalculating. The independent filmmaker uses sound design here to emphasize David's isolation. The ambient noise of the party becomes muffled, replaced by the sound of David's own breathing or the clink of his glass. This is the visual and auditory representation of the social ghosting. He is there, but he is a reminder of failure, a memento mori for every married man in the room. Historical trends show that men in this position often retreat into work or isolation, which further feeds the narrative of their instability. The step-by-step deconstruction of David's identity continues with the loss of his hobbies. In many indie films, we see the protagonist forced to give up the things that once connected him to his peers: the golf club membership, the season tickets, the expensive cycling group. This isn't just a financial decision, it's a social one. By removing himself from these spaces, the man accelerates his own erasure. The independent lens focuses on the items being sold on digital marketplaces. Each transaction is a piece of his social life being converted into legal fees. The data on male isolation is stark. Men are significantly more likely than women to experience a total collapse of their social world post-divorce, leading to increased potential outcomes of long-term depression and health decline. Furthermore, the 2026 independent film explores the phenomenon of the digital ghost. David finds that even his past is being edited. Shared photos on social media are deleted or cropped. The digital record of his marriage is systematically purged. This is a unique form of 21st century psychological warfare. The man is not just losing his future, he is losing the evidence that his past ever existed. Indie cinema captures the frantic energy of the man trying to save these digital artifacts, only to realize that the platforms themselves are biased toward the one who moves first to claim the account. The character assassination reaches its peak in the courtroom or the mediation room, where the social isolation is used as evidence. The fact that David has no one to vouch for him, that his social circle has evaporated, is framed as proof of his poor character. The independent film shows the irony of the situation. The system creates the isolation and then punishes the man for being isolated. This is the deep dive into the structural bias of the domestic legal narrative. We see the man's frustration as he tries to explain that he didn't choose to be alone, but the record only shows the result, not the process. Step by step, the man learns to navigate the silence. He begins to find new, marginal spaces where his status as a divorced man isn't a liability. He finds the late-night diners, the 24-hour gyms, the anonymous online forums. The independent film tracks this transition from the center of the community to the fringes. It's a grueling process of reinvention. But just as David begins to find a new rhythm, a new threat emerges. What happens when the social erasure isn't enough, and the conflict moves into the psychological interior? How does a man in 2026 maintain his sanity when the very concept of his own memory is being challenged by the legal record? In the next part of this masterclass, we will explore the internal collapse. We will dive into the cinematic depiction of the male's psychological breakdown, not as a loud theatrical event, but as a quiet systemic failure. What are the specific visual cues that independent films use to show a man losing his grip on reality? And what is the one psychological trap that men in 2026 fall into that makes their recovery almost impossible? We move from the social world into the mind of the protagonist, as we continue our deep dive into the hard truths of the male experience in American independent film. The internal collapse of the male protagonist in American independent film is not marked by a sudden theatrical explosion but by a quiet systemic failure of the self. To understand the 2026 male character, we have to look at the psychological interior as a house being emptied of its furniture one piece at a time. Imagine if you are Chris, a 39-year-old marketing director in Chicago in the year 2026. In the film of Chris's life, the breakdown doesn't happen in the courtroom. It happens in a Target parking lot at 11 p.m. Chris is sitting in his car, staring at a bag of household essentials he had to buy because he no longer has access to the ones in his former home. The independent film stays on his face for an uncomfortably long time. We see the step-by-step process of his cognitive dissonance. On one hand, Chris has spent a decade believing he is a provider, a protector, and a stable pillar of his community. On the other hand, the legal affidavits he just read on his phone describe him as a volatile, secondary presence in his children's lives. This is the psychological fracture that indie cinema explores with clinical precision. Historical trends in these films show a shift from the angry man to the bewildered man. The character is trapped in a loop of trying to reconcile his internal identity with the external legal record. The data on male psychological health during divorce suggests that this loss of identity is the primary driver of long-term distress. In 2026, this is exacerbated by the digital panopticon. Chris isn't just dealing with his own thoughts. He is dealing with the digital ghost of his former life. His social media memories serve him photos of a vacation from 3 years ago, while his legal app sends him a notification about a missed discovery deadline. The independent filmmaker uses this to show that the man's mind is no longer a private sanctuary. It is a contested territory. Step by step, we see the erosion of Chris's executive function. This is a recurring theme in the deep dive of male divorce narratives. It begins with the sleep deprivation cycle. Independent films like Manchester by the Sea or Blue Valentine use lighting and sound design to communicate this. The scenes are often dimly lit, with a persistent, low-frequency hum that mimics the sound of a that cannot turn off. We see Chris lying awake, lit only by the blue light of his smartphone, scrolling through old text messages to find evidence of his own sanity. This is a case study in the obsession with the record. The man becomes a detective in his own life, trying to find the exact moment things went wrong. The potential outcomes of this obsession are almost always negative, leading to a state of hypervigilance that makes professional and social recovery nearly impossible. The visual cues of this breakdown are subtle but devastating. In the independent lens, we look for the loss of the grooming ritual. We see Chris go from a well-dressed professional to a man who hasn't shaved in 4 days, not out of laziness, but out of a total lack of mirror recognition. He looks at his reflection and doesn't see himself anymore. He sees the person the court says he is. The filmmaker might use a shaky, handheld camera to follow Chris through his day, emphasizing his lack of balance. This is the physical manifestation of the psychological interior. His world is literally tilting. Data shows that men in this phase experience a significant increase in cortisol levels and a corresponding decline in cognitive flexibility. They become stuck in a binary way of thinking. I am either a victim or a villain. We must also analyze the psychological trap of the return to normalcy. This is the one mistake that almost every male protagonist in an independent film makes in 2026. Chris spends his mental energy trying to rebuild a version of his life that no longer exists. He tries to recreate the family Sunday dinner in his new one-bedroom apartment. He buys the same brand of cereal his kids like, even though they aren't there to eat it. This is a step-by-step process of self-sabotage through nostalgia. The independent film shows the cruelty of this hope. We see the table set for 4, but Chris is eating alone. The filmmaker uses this to highlight the concept of ambiguous loss, the grief of losing someone who is still alive. Unlike a death where there is a clear ritual of mourning, divorce in the independent narrative is a funeral that never ends. Case studies of recent indie scripts highlight the role of the workplace as the final crumbling pillar. For Chris, his job in Chicago was his primary source of external validation. But as his internal world collapses, his performance begins to slip. We see the step-by-step breakdown of his professional persona. He misses a deadline. He snaps at a junior colleague. He forgets the details of a major campaign. In the 2026 cinematic landscape, this is often depicted through the lens of digital surveillance. His boss doesn't have to guess that something is wrong. The company's productivity software is already flagging his decline. The film shows the cold, corporate reaction to his personal tragedy. He is given a link to an employee assistance program and a subtle hint that his future with the company is being reassessed. This is the structural reality of the male experience. When the domestic foundation goes, the professional structure often follows. Furthermore, we see the man's attempt to self-medicate his psychological pain. In independent film, this isn't usually portrayed as a glamorous addiction. It is the mundane, slow-motion self-destruction of an extra drink every night, or the mindless scrolling of dating apps to find a temporary reprieve from the silence. These are the potential outcomes of a man who has no emotional vocabulary for what he is experiencing. The indie film focuses on the hollow feeling after these distractions. We see Chris staring at his phone after a string of meaningless interactions, realizing that he is more alone than he was before. The data on post-divorce isolation for men highlights this as a critical risk factor for long-term health issues. The psychological interior reaches its absolute floor in the scene of the empty house. After the final assets have been divided, Chris returns to the family home one last time to pick up the last of his belongings. The filmmaker uses the empty rooms to represent the empty spaces in Chris's mind. Every corner of the house holds a memory that has now been legally reclassified. This is the step-by-step deconstruction of his history. He isn't just leaving a building. He is leaving the physical evidence of his adulthood. The film stays on him as he closes the door for the last time. There is no triumphant music. There is only the sound of the lock clicking into place. But what happens when the silence of the empty house is interrupted by a new, unexpected presence? How does a man in 2026 handle the re-entry of his own parents into his life, or the sudden, forced intimacy of a roommate situation in a city he can no longer afford? And what is the specific 5-word sentence that a man's child says to him that finally shatters the last of his carefully constructed defenses? We move from the collapse of the mind into the complicated, often painful attempt at rebuilding relationships, as we continue this deep dive into the male experience in American independent film. In the next part, we examine the shifting dynamics of the father-child bond, and the cinematic portrayal of the man who must learn to parent from the outside looking in. The father-child bond in American independent film is often portrayed as a series of missed connections and desperate overcompensations. To understand the 2026 male character in this context, we have to look at the transition from being a daily presence to becoming a scheduled visitor. This is the moment the father realizes that his authority has been replaced by an itinerary. Imagine if you are Mark, a 45-year-old architect living in Phoenix in the year 2026. In the film of Mark's life, the most high-stakes scene isn't a courtroom battle. It is the Friday evening handover in a neutral parking lot. The independent lens focuses on the geography of this exchange. The camera stays at a distance, capturing the awkward physical space between Mark and his former spouse as the children move from one car to the other like refugees of a domestic war. This is the step-by-step ritual of the transition. Mark has prepared for this for days. He has the weekend plan with military precision, but the independent film shows the immediate collapse of that plan. Historical trends in these narratives highlight the phenomenon of the Disney dad, the father who feels forced to provide constant entertainment because he is terrified of the silence. In the 2026 cinematic landscape, this is exacerbated by the comparison culture of social media. Mark doesn't just want to see his kids. He feels he must curate a highlight reel of their time together to prove his value to the world and perhaps to the court. We see the potential outcomes of this pressure in the case study of After Sun, where the father's internal despair is masked by a desperate attempt to create a perfect vacation memory. The independent filmmaker uses the grainy texture of video or the cold clarity of a smartphone screen to show the gap between the recorded fun and the actual emotional distance. The step-by-step breakdown of the weekend reveals that the more Mark tries to force a connection, the more his children drift toward the familiarity of their primary home. Data on paternal involvement shows that the quality of the father-child relationship post-divorce is heavily influenced by the father's ability to maintain a role as a disciplinarian and a mentor, rather than just a source of entertainment. However, independent film shows the structural barriers to this. Mark finds that he cannot be a parent in a vacuum. Without the context of a shared home, his attempts at discipline feel like intrusions. The film shows a scene where Mark tries to enforce a bedtime or a homework rule, and the response from his 12-year-old son is the 5-word sentence that shatters the last of his defenses. "I want to go home." In this context, home is not where Mark is. Home is the place he was exiled from. The filmmaker stays on Mark's face as he absorbs this. This isn't just a child's whim. It is a legal and emotional statement of Mark's status as a secondary figure. We must also analyze the role of technology in the 2026 father-child bond. In modern independent films, the FaceTime call or the AI-moderated co-parenting app becomes a character of its own. We see Mark sitting in his quiet apartment, staring at a small digital square of his daughter's face. The independent lens captures the frustration of the digital divide. The lag in the audio, the pixelated image, and the way the child's attention is constantly pulled away by the life happening behind the camera. This is the step-by-step erosion of intimacy. The man is relegated to a screen. Case studies of recent indie scripts show protagonists who become obsessed with these digital windows, leading to potential outcomes of hypersurveillance and increased conflict with the ex-spouse. The film uses the blue light of the screen to wash out Mark's features, making him look like a ghost in his own family's life. The concept of the empty chair at school events is another recurring visual motif. Independent cinema focuses on the man standing at the back of the auditorium or the edge of the soccer field. He is there, but he is not of the group. We see the step-by-step process of social navigation. Who does he talk to? Where does he sit? The filmmaker uses sound design to emphasize the isolation, making the cheers of the other parents sound distant and hollow. This reflects the historical trend where fathers often feel like outsiders in the educational and social spheres of their children's lives post-divorce. The data suggests that many men eventually stop attending these events because the psychological cost of the discomfort outweighs the benefit of the brief interaction. The indie film tracks this slow withdrawal, showing the man's absence as a growing shadow in the children's narrative. Furthermore, we explore the archetype of the child as a mediator or a spy. In films like The Squid and the Whale, the children are forced to navigate the complex emotional landscape of their parents' war. Independent film shows the step-by-step way children begin to mirror the language of the court. They learn to be diplomatic. They learn what information to share and what to withhold. This creates a new guarded dynamic between the father and the child. Mark realizes that his children are no longer just his children. They are observers of his decline. He feels the need to perform a version of stability that he hasn't yet achieved. This performance is a key element of the 2026 male experience in film, the man who is pretending to be okay for the sake of the children, while the audience sees the cracks in the facade. The step-by-step deconstruction of the fatherhood identity culminates in the realization that the relationship must be completely rebuilt from the ground up. The old rules don't apply. The independent film shows the man's first tentative steps toward a new kind of parenting, one based on vulnerability rather than authority. We see a scene where Mark stops trying to be the fun dad and simply sits in silence with his children. No movies, no games, no curated experiences. Just the raw, uncomfortable reality of their new life. This is where the potential outcomes for healing begin. The filmmaker uses a long, static shot to show the family simply existing together in the small apartment. It is not a happy scene, but it is an honest one. However, as Mark begins to find this new, fragile equilibrium with his children, a new variable enters the equation. The arrival of a new partner, either his own or his ex-spouse, threatens to destabilize the entire structure once again. How does a man in 2026 navigate the introduction of a step-parent into the digital and physical lives of his children? What are the specific visual cues that indicate the man is being replaced not just as a husband, but as a primary male influence? And what is the one phone call that every divorced father dreads? The one that signals the permanent shifting of the family center of gravity. We move from the bond with the children to the complex, often volatile world of reentry and new relationships, as we continue this deep dive into the male experience in American independent film. In the next part, we examine the cinematic portrayal of the new woman and the psychological warfare of the blended family. The introduction of a third party into the post-divorce narrative in American independent film acts as a catalyst for a second, more profound loss of identity. In this cinematic space, the arrival of a new partner is never a simple romantic subplot. It is a tactical deployment that shifts the domestic power structure permanently. To understand the 2026 male character, we must look at the archetype of the replacement figure. This is often represented as a man who is the visual and functional opposite of our protagonist. Imagine if you are Jason, a 40-year-old high school history teacher in Columbus, Ohio, in the year 2026. In the film of Jason's life, he has spent the last year adjusting to a cramped apartment and a modest lifestyle. Then he arrives for a Sunday evening pickup and sees a high-end electric SUV parked in his former driveway. Out walks Brian. Brian is younger, works in sustainable tech, and is currently helping Jason's son calibrate a new drone. The independent film focuses on the spatial dynamics of this encounter. The camera doesn't cut to a close-up of a confrontation. It stays wide, showing Jason standing on the sidewalk while the three of them, his ex-wife, his son, and Brian, exist within the warm glow of the smart home's porch light. Jason is physically and symbolically in the dark. This is the step-by-step process of the domestic upgrade. Historical trends in independent cinema suggest that the newcomer is often framed as the stabilizing force that the biological father failed to be. In films like Boyhood, we see this played out through a succession of stepfathers who each impose a new set of rules and a new identity on the children. The biological father, played by Ethan Hawke, is relegated to the cool uncle role, someone who provides fun but lacks the structural authority of the man living in the house. Data on blended families in the United States shows that nearly 40% of households with children include at least one step-parent, yet independent film focuses on the psychological warfare inherent in this transition. For Jason in 2026, the warfare is conducted through the lens of the smart home and shared digital accounts. He realizes that Brian now has administrative access to the home security system Jason installed. Brian can see when Jason drops the kids off. Brian can adjust the thermostat in the rooms where Jason used to sleep. This is the digital erasure of the father. The filmmaker uses a step-by-step breakdown of Jason's realization, showing him trying to log into a shared streaming service, only to find the profile names have changed. This is a case study in the loss of domestic legacy. We must also analyze the role of the new woman in the protagonist's life. In the independent narrative, the man's first post-divorce relationship is often a mirror to his own instability. She is the rebound who highlights the hollow space where his family used to be. We see this in films like Blue Valentine or The Meddler, where the man's attempts to date are portrayed as desperate, clumsy, and ultimately hollow. The independent lens focuses on the mundane details of these new dates, the awkward silences, the mismatched expectations, and the constant intrusive presence of his past. The filmmaker uses these scenes to show that the man is not looking for a new partner. He is looking for a way to stop being alone. The potential outcomes of these early relationships are often depicted as a further erosion of his self-esteem. Step by step, the independent film deconstructs the myth of the successful blended family. While mainstream media might show a harmonious Thanksgiving dinner, the indie film shows the tension beneath the surface. We see a scene where Jason is invited to his daughter's birthday party, now held at Brian's house. The filmmaker uses a high-retention editing style to show the sensory overload Jason experiences. The unfamiliar smell of the house, the new toys he didn't buy, and the way his children look to Brian for permission before eating cake. This is the visualization of the outsider status. The data suggests that for many divorced fathers, these social gatherings are the most psychologically taxing moments of the post-divorce experience. The independent film captures the physical manifestation of this stress, the tightened jaw, the forced smile, and the way Jason grips his drink as if it's the only thing keeping him grounded. Furthermore, we explore the concept of the competitive provider. In the 2026 landscape, this competition is often financial and technological. Brian buys the kids the latest VR headsets. Jason can only afford the subscription to the educational software. The film shows the step-by-step way the children's loyalty is subtly tested. It's not that they love Brian more. It's that Brian represents a version of life that is easier and more exciting. This is a deep dive into the commodification of fatherhood. The independent filmmaker uses the contrast between the two environments, the bright, high-tech world of the new home and the dimly lit, functional world of Jason's apartment, to show the inherent inequality of the situation. Case studies of recent scripts highlight the psychological tactic of the subtle comparison. The ex-spouse might mention how helpful Brian is with the yard work, or how he has stabilized the children's routine. These are not overt attacks, but they serve to highlight Jason's perceived inadequacies. The film tracks the internal monologue of the protagonist as he absorbs these hits. We see the potential outcomes of this cumulative stress. The man begins to withdraw not just from his ex-spouse, but from the children themselves, feeling that he can no longer compete with the version of a father that the new partner represents. The step-by-step erosion of the man's role in the blended family culminates in the loss of the naming rights. We see a scene where Jason's youngest child accidentally calls Brian Dad. The filmmaker stays on Jason's face for a long static shot. The silence in the room is deafening. This is the absolute floor of the displacement. It's the moment the man realizes that his biological connection is being overwritten by daily proximity and superior resources. The film uses this moment to pivot toward the man's physical and mental health decline. He has lost his home, his social circle, his career stability, and now his unique status as the father. But as Jason sits in his car after the birthday party, staring at the suburban house that used to be his, a new and darker realization begins to take hold. It isn't just about the loss of the family, it's about the loss of the body. How does the cumulative trauma of these domestic replacements manifest as a physical breakdown? What are the specific health indicators, from the sudden weight loss to the onset of chronic insomnia, that independent films use to signal that the protagonist has reached his breaking point? And what is the one physical symptom that every male protagonist in these films ignores until it's almost too late? In the next part of this masterclass, we move from the external warfare of the blended family into the internal biological collapse. We examine the cinematic portrayal of the man's physical decline and the terrifying data on male health outcomes in the 5 years following a contested divorce. We dive into the imagery of the hospital room and the pharmacy as we continue this deep dive into the hard truths of the male experience in American independent film. What happens when the spirit breaks and the body finally follows? We find out as the masterclass continues. The biological collapse of the male protagonist in American independent film is the final frontier of the narrative. When the legal system has taken the home and the social circle has evaporated, the trauma migrates into the marrow. To understand the 2026 male character, we have to look at the body as a failing infrastructure. Imagine if you are Robert, a 48-year-old insurance adjuster living in a rented corporate suite in Atlanta. In the film of Robert's life, the year is 2026, and his health is managed by a suite of biometric wearables that provide a constant, cold stream of data regarding his decline. The independent filmmaker doesn't use a dramatic heart attack to show Robert's pain. Instead, they use a step-by-step visualization of chronic inflammation. We see Robert waking up at 3:14 a.m., the blue light of his smart ring flashing a notification that his heart rate variability has bottomed out. This is the physiological signature of a body in a state of permanent fight or flight. Historical trends in independent cinema have moved away from the external violence of the 1970s and 80s toward a more clinical, internal destruction. In films like Manchester by the Sea, we see a protagonist whose body is literally a scarred map of his past. In the 2026 cinematic landscape, this is portrayed through the lens of the metabolic breakdown. Robert is not just sad. He is experiencing a systemic failure. The data on male health post-divorce in the United States shows a significant increase in the potential outcomes of cardiovascular disease and immune system dysfunction. Independent film captures this by focusing on the mundane medicalization of the man. We see a scene of Robert in a CVS pharmacy at midnight, standing in an aisle of generic sleep aids and antacids. The filmmaker stays on the fluorescent hum of the store, emphasizing the sterile, lonely nature of his self-care. This is a step-by-step breakdown of the man becoming a patient of his own life. The visual palette of the physical decline in indie film is often defined by the gray and green hues of the urban environment. Robert's skin begins to take on the texture of the paperwork he is constantly signing. The filmmaker uses high contrast lighting to emphasize the new lines on his face and the bags under his eyes. This isn't just aging. It is the physical manifestation of the adversarial process. Case studies of men in high-conflict divorces show that the stress of litigation can accelerate cellular aging by years. In the film, we see a scene where Robert tries to go to the gym, the classic divorce body attempt. But the independent lens shows the futility of it. He is on a treadmill running nowhere, while his smartwatch tells him his stress levels are too high for exercise. The irony is palpable. He is trying to save his life in a way that is actually straining his heart. This highlights the data suggesting that forced lifestyle changes during a period of acute trauma can sometimes lead to paradoxical health risks. Furthermore, we must examine the sound design of the body's failure. Independent cinema uses sound to communicate the internal collapse. We hear the high-pitched ring of tinnitus during a mediation session. We hear the heavy, irregular thud of Robert's heart in the silence of his apartment. These auditory cues serve as a step-by-step countdown. The man is a ticking clock. The film might use an actual clinical setting to ground this in reality. Imagine a scene where Robert is in an MRI machine for unexplained chest pains. The machine's mechanical rhythmic pounding becomes the soundtrack of his life. It is the sound of the system scanning for a soul, and only finding a stressed-out biological machine. The potential outcomes of this chronic stress are depicted as a loss of sensory precision. Robert begins to lose his sense of taste, he finds light too bright, and the world becomes a sensory assault he can no longer manage. Step by step, the independent film deconstructs the myth of the resilient male. We see the loss of the circadian rhythm. Robert no longer sleeps. He merely loses consciousness for 3-hour intervals. The filmmaker shows the ritual of the morning. The double shot of espresso to mask the exhaustion, the beta blocker to mask the anxiety, and the high-sodium frozen meal because he no longer has the energy to cook. This is a deep dive into the nutritional neglect that characterizes the post-divorce male experience. Data indicates that divorced men in the U.S. have significantly higher rates of metabolic syndrome compared to their married or never married counterparts. The independent film doesn't look away from the unwashed dishes or the empty pill bottles. It shows that the domestic collapse is a precursor to a biological one. The case study of a film like A Serious Man provides a look at the somatization of the legal process. The protagonist's life is falling apart, and his body reacts with a series of inexplicable ailments. In the 2026 version of this narrative, Robert's AI-driven health app begins to suggest he seeks psychological counseling, a suggestion he ignores until he experiences a full-blown panic attack in the middle of a grocery store. The independent filmmaker treats the panic attack not as a moment of weakness, but as a systemic reboot. Robert is standing in front of a wall of yogurt, and suddenly the world tilts. He can't breathe. He thinks he is dying. This is the moment the body finally says no. The potential outcomes of this crisis are either a total withdrawal or a forced medical intervention. The film tracks the step-by-step process of Robert being wheeled into an emergency room. Realize he has no one to list as his emergency contact. The camera stays on the intake form, specifically the blank line where a name should be. This is the visual representation of the social and biological isolation converging. The physical decline also impacts the professional sphere, creating a feedback loop of failure. Robert's tremors during a presentation lead to a loss of confidence from his clients. His cognitive fog leads to errors in his insurance adjustments. The filmmaker uses the digital interface of Robert's work laptop to show his declining productivity. We see his cursor hovering over a simple task, unable to complete it. This is the step-by-step erasure of the man's competence. The data suggests that the intersection of health decline and job loss is a primary factor in the long-term poverty of divorced men. The independent film captures this by showing the man's world shrinking. He moves from a multi-room suite to a smaller studio as his health and income drop in tandem. In the final stages of the biological collapse, the independent film often introduces a moment of forced stillness. Robert is prescribed bed rest or is simply too exhausted to move. He is forced to exist in the silence of his own skin. The filmmaker uses this time to show the man finally confronting the emotional weight he has been trying to outrun. We see him looking at the scar on his hand from a domestic accident years ago, or the way his wedding ring has left a permanent indentation on his finger even though the ring is gone. This is the step-by-step reconciliation with the past through the body. But as Robert lies in his dimly lit studio, his phone buzzing with a final legal notification, he realizes that the physical collapse is only a symptom of a deeper, more fundamental ending. What happens when the legal decree finally arrives, and the paper version of the man's life is officially closed? Does the body recover when the case is over, or is the damage permanent? And what is the one thing the legal decree cannot account for? The one lingering thread of the marriage that will continue to haunt Robert's health for the rest of his life. We move from the hospital room to the final signing of the papers as we continue this deep dive into the male experience in American independent film. In the next part, we examine the anatomy of the final decree and the cold reality of the aftermath. The battle is over, but who is left to claim the victory? The masterclass continues. The final decree is not a climax. It is an administrative execution. In the world of American independent film, the moment the judge signs the paper or the final digital signature is authenticated is rarely accompanied by a sense of relief. Instead, it is portrayed as the official date of death for a man's former identity. To understand the 2026 male character, we have to look at the transition from the chaos of litigation to the cold, sterile reality of the aftermath. Imagine if you are Robert, the insurance adjuster from Atlanta we have been following. It is a Tuesday afternoon in 2026. Robert is not in a courtroom with a gavel banging in the background. He is at his desk in his reduced-size office, staring at a notification on his secure legal portal. The final decree is a PDF attachment. This is the step-by-step reality of the modern divorce. The dissolution of a 15-year union, handled with the same digital indifference as a software update. Historical trends in independent cinema have shifted from the theatrical confrontations of the past to this kind of quiet, bureaucratic finality. In the 2026 cinematic landscape, the final decree is the moment the man realizes that his life has been reduced to a series of clauses and stipulations. The independent filmmaker focuses on the language of the document. Words like extinguished, terminated, and dissolved appear in high contrast text on the screen. This is a case study in the power of legal nomenclature. For Robert, the decree is a 140-page document that dictates the potential outcomes of his life for the next decade. It outlines exactly how many miles he can live from his children's school, the exact percentage of his bonus that belongs to a person he no longer speaks to, and the specific dates he is allowed to feel like a father. The filmmaker stays on Robert's face as he scrolls through the document, highlighting the realization that his autonomy has been legally partitioned. Data on the aftermath of contested divorces in the United States suggests that the period immediately following the final decree is when the highest risk of psychological collapse occurs. The battle is over, and the adrenaline that sustained the man through the litigation has evaporated. Independent film captures this through the lens of the ghost marriage. This is the phenomenon where a man is legally single, but remains financially and logistically tethered to his past. Robert's decree includes a series of financial obligations that act as a permanent weight on his recovery. He is paying for a mortgage on a house he cannot enter and tuition for children he only sees on a screen. The independent lens focuses on the physical act of the transfer, the monthly notification of the automated payment, leaving his bank account. This is the step-by-step representation of the financial shadow. It is not just about the money, it is about the constant recurring reminder of his loss of status. We must also analyze the cinematic portrayal of the administrative aftermath. In 2026, this involves the systematic purging of the man from every shared digital and social infrastructure. Robert has to change the beneficiaries on his life insurance, the emergency contact on his medical records, and even the shared passwords for the utilities. The independent filmmaker uses a attention montage to show this process. It is a series of digital forms, checkboxes, and confirmation emails. Each click is a small surgical removal of his former life. This reflects the historical trend where men often find the administrative burden of the split to be more taxing than the emotional one. The potential outcomes of this process are a sense of profound disorientation. Robert finds himself in a world where he is a single unit in a system designed for families. He is the person at the grocery store buying a single steak, the person at the car dealership looking for a vehicle that fits a lifestyle he no longer leads. The case study of a film like Marriage Story or Blue Valentine shows that the victory in a divorce is a myth. In independent film, even the man who gets the custody arrangement he wanted or the asset split he fought for is shown to be diminished. The filmmaker uses the concept of the empty victory to deconstruct the adversarial nature of the U.S. legal system. Robert might have kept his retirement account, but he lost the person he intended to spend it with. He might have secured shared custody, but he lost the daily mundane intimacy of being a father. The step-by-step breakdown of this realization often happens in the silence of the first night after the decree is final. Robert sits in his apartment, and for the first time in years, the phone isn't ringing with a call from his lawyer. The silence is not peaceful. It is deafening. It is the sound of a vacuum where a life used to be. Furthermore, we explore the social and professional fallout of the final decree. For Robert in 2026, the finality of the divorce means he can no longer hide behind the excuse of being in the middle of a process. He is now officially a divorced man. The independent film shows the reaction of his professional network. His LinkedIn profile changes, his tax filing status changes, and his social invitations dry up completely. The filmmaker uses the visual motif of the solo traveler. Robert is seen eating alone in a busy restaurant, the camera emphasizing the empty chair across from him. This is the deep dive into the social erasure we discussed earlier, now made permanent by the law. The data suggests that men who do not successfully reintegrate into a new social circle within 2 years of the final decree face significantly higher risks of long-term isolation. The final decree also marks the beginning of the reentry phase. This is where the 2026 independent film introduces the theme of the new normal. Robert has to learn a new language of interaction. He has to learn how to speak to his ex-spouse as a co-parenting business partner rather than a romantic one. The filmmaker shows the step-by-step process of this communication: the guarded, formal emails and the brief, transactional text messages. This is the clinical reality of the post-divorce relationship. It is a relationship stripped of all its history and reduced to its most basic functional components. The independent lens doesn't offer a hopeful montage of healing. It offers a realistic observation of endurance. Robert is not moving on, he is moving through. But as the final pages of the PDF are read and the digital file is saved to a folder named Personal Closed, a new question emerges. The legal battle is done, the physical collapse has been managed, and the social circle has been reset. But what is the final image of the man who survives? In the world of American independent film, there is no sunset to ride off into. There is only the next morning. What does the first morning of the rest of a man's life actually look like when the system is finished with him? And what is the one haunting realization that hits every man in 2026 as he looks at his children and realizes that while the case is closed, the consequences have only just begun to manifest in their lives? In the final part of this masterclass, we reach the conclusion of our deep dive. We examine the rebirth and the final reckoning. We look at the cinematic depiction of the man who finally stops looking back and the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of the blank slate. We analyze the final scenes of the most impactful independent films of the last decade to find the answer to the ultimate question. After the great unraveling, what is actually left to build with? We conclude the male experience in American independent film with the anatomy of the new beginning. The deep dive ends here. The first morning of the blank slate begins not with a sunrise, but with the absence of noise. For Robert, waking up in his studio apartment in the spring of 2026, the silence is heavy. It is the first day after the legal portal confirmed the closure of his case. And for the first time in years, he is not a defendant, a petitioner, or a client. He is simply a man in a room. In American independent film, this moment is the actual beginning of the second act, though the credits are about to roll. The camera stays on the protagonist as he performs the first mundane tasks of his new life. There is a specific cinematic trope we see in the final frames of these stories: a man making a pot of coffee. It is a step-by-step ritual of reclamation. He isn't making it for a family. He isn't making it to survive a deposition. He is making it because he exists. This is the anatomy of the new beginning. A construction site where the only material left is the self. Historical trends in indie cinema suggest that the most powerful endings are the ones that offer no easy resolution, only a quiet, sustainable resilience. Think of the final shot in Manchester by the Sea, where Lee and Patrick are fishing on the boat. Nothing has been fixed, the trauma is still present, but they are moving forward in the same direction. In the 2026 cinematic context, this resilience is portrayed through the lens of the radical acceptance of a diminished lifestyle. Robert's apartment is 1/3 the size of his previous home, but the independent filmmaker uses the lighting to show it as a sanctuary, rather than a cell. The potential outcomes of this phase are dictated by how the man chooses to fill the space. Data on male recovery post-divorce suggests that the most successful long-term outcomes are found in men who lean into the concept of the intentional life, where every object in the room and every minute of the day is chosen, not inherited from a former identity. We must analyze the step-by-step reconstruction of the man's physical environment as a narrative arc. In the film of Robert's life, we see him buying a single high-quality chair. We see him hanging a piece of art that his ex-spouse always disliked. This is the visual language of the rebirth. It is a slow, methodical process of de-identifying with the collective and re-identifying with the individual. Independent film focuses on these small, tactile moments because they represent the only area where the man has total agency. The financial data of 2026 shows that while many men experience a significant drop in net worth, their discretionary spending often shifts toward high-impact, personal experiences. Cinema captures this by showing the man engaging in a hobby he abandoned decades ago. Not as a midlife crisis, but as a retrieval of a lost part of his soul. The final reckoning with the children is the most complex part of the anatomy of the new beginning. In the 2026 landscape, the relationship has moved past the awkwardness of the visitation schedule and into a new phase of honesty. Independent films like Boyhood provide a case study for this long-term transition. We see the father character eventually stop performing and start being present. He stops being the Disney dad and starts being the father who listens. The step-by-step detail of this change is shown in the dialogue. The conversations are no longer about the schedule, they are about life. For Robert, this happens in a scene where he is teaching his daughter how to cook a meal in his small kitchen. There is no mention of the mother, no mention of the court, and no mention of the past. There is only the transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. This is the legacy that remains when the assets are gone. We also explore the shift from the adversarial mindset to the collaborative ghost. Even though the legal decree is final, the 2026 man realizes that he will be in a relationship with his ex-spouse for the rest of his life through the medium of their children. The independent film shows the potential outcomes of the cold peace. We see a scene where Robert and his ex-wife attend a graduation. They do not sit together, but they acknowledge each other with a nod that carries the weight of 100 battles and 1,000 compromises. The filmmaker stays on this look, a recognition that they are both survivors of the same storm. This is the historical trend of the mature indie ending. The realization that the divorce didn't end the family, it merely changed its shape. The psychological pivot in these final scenes is the transition from survivor to architect. Robert is no longer defined by what was taken from him, but by what he chooses to build. The data on male resilience indicates that once the initial 2-year period of high stress has passed, many men report a new sense of clarity and purpose. Independent cinema captures this by showing the protagonist in a state of flow. We see him at his job, the one that was almost lost during the collapse, performing with a new quiet competence. He is no longer working to maintain a facade. He is working to support a life he actually understands. The film uses a steady, confident camera movement to mirror this internal stability. The tremors we saw in the earlier parts are gone. The body has finally caught up with the reality of the mind. Furthermore, we must address the final image of the man who survives. In the most impactful independent films, the final shot is often of the man walking away from the camera or looking out toward an uncertain horizon. This is the open loop of the rebirth. The filmmaker is telling the US audience that the story isn't over. It has simply moved into a territory that no longer requires an audience. For Robert, the final scene is him walking through a park in Atlanta. He is alone, but he is not isolated. He is part of the world again. The potential outcomes of his future are unknown, but he is no longer afraid of the uncertainty. He has survived the legal meat grinder, the biological collapse, and the social erasure. He is the man who remains. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we have to recognize that the American independent film is the only medium that gives the male divorce experience the gravity it deserves. It doesn't offer a guarantee of happiness, but it offers a study in possibility. It shows that while the system can take your house, your savings, and your social standing, it cannot take your ability to define your own meaning. The great unraveling is, in fact, a stripping away of everything that was not true. What is left is the foundation. But while Robert has found his peace in the quiet of his new life, a new generation of men is just beginning their own first chapter of the unraveling. How will the next wave of independent filmmakers capture the shift from the digital panopticon to the era of biometric litigation? And what happens when the very definition of a father is challenged by the emerging technologies of the late 2020s? The story of the American man in transition is an ongoing epic, and while this masterclass on the cinema of the past and present ends here, the real-world data of the future is already being written. In our next series, we will dive into the anatomy of the modern family in the age of decentralized living. The deep dive continues, but in a new direction. Thank you for being part of the class.